After a long car ride back to New Star City, I eventually made my way home, being dropped off by Victor, taking my bag inside and immediately going to bed. I just wanted this night to end. I woke up the following morning to the sound of my stomach growling at me furiously, to which I had to put down an enormous quantity of food. Fighting really amps up my hunger. The harder the fight, the bigger the meal I have to have afterwards. And I was so exhausted last night that I didn't even bother to eat, even though I was starving. So I stuffed my face to my heart's content. Basically cleared out the fridge, leaving very little in there, and sitting down on the couch with a full stomach at last. Eventually, I had to call Ned and inform him that I needed his help putting the armor back together. He was, of course, a bit upset about it, but he got over it fairly quickly, especially after I got into the details of why exactly I had to scrap the armor. He seemed far more interested in the whole monsters are real thing, and eventually agreed to come over and help me put the armor back together. He even did me the favor of running out and getting me a new phone, which I of course reimbursed him for. And eventually, things got back to a semblance of normal, with some changes. Two primarily, the first of which being that I found a little bit of a solution for the whole problem with me being the only one to be able to hear Nylea, which sort of put a crimp in conversations whenever I'd have to stop and talk to her instead of talking to my other friends. They'd always have to question me about what she was saying. It was sort of tedious to constantly repeat her. But with a little bit of experimentation, I was actually able to make heavy metal ventriloquism work for me. And so soon after figuring out how to do it too, I began being able to transmit Nylea's speech through the orb, creating a sphere of liquid metal and then transmitting the patterns that Nylea spoke to me in through it. At first it was a little bit difficult, as there seemed to be a bit of a time gap between Nylea actually saying it and the orb producing the sound. But after a little bit of work, I was able to get it so that they were perfectly lined up. To me, it kind of felt like Nylea was speaking into a microphone whenever she talked through it. But that was fairly dealable. Better than the sound of there being a constant echo, her saying it in my head first and then it coming out of a microphone a few seconds later. Eventually, I got used to it, as did Ned and even Vicky, beginning to have fun talking with Nylea. They tried to probe her for information on me, but she told them that the relationship between a symbiote and its host is sacred, and that it's not up to her to deal out informations about my psychology and the inner workings of my mind. My thoughts were my own. And the second change that I had to deal with was the heavy metal spirit, which, while it did always have my best interest at heart, was a conscious living thing that I couldn't just give absolute unabiding orders to. It began to simply emerge on its own, popping up whenever it felt like. And while it seemed to understand me really well when it came to combat, regular communication was exceptionally difficult. It seemed like it could understand emotional intent, but not the actual words that I was saying, merely the emotion that I wished to convey. We also began to discover some very interesting things about the heavy metal spirit. For example, that it didn't actually see. Well, at least not in the sense that we saw. We made this discovery by turning on the television, and found that the heavy metal spirit couldn't actually see what was on the television. It could hear the sound, sense the location of the TV, where the sound waves were coming from, but it couldn't actually see what was on the screen. Our best guess was that the heavy metal spirit somehow possessed some sort of echolocation, or at least that's the closest we could surmise it, but that otherwise it was basically blind, which made trying to teach it to communicate exceptionally difficult. But the heavy metal spirit could actually feel sensations, which gave Vicky a bright idea, that we just treat heavy metal spirit as if they were blind. Blind people learn to see and communicate in other ways. They learn how to read and speak and do things like that, so why couldn't the heavy metal spirit? So we went out and got some visually impaired learning tools, beginning to try to teach the heavy metal spirit to learn to read Braille, learn the alphabet, things like that. Some audio cassettes and things like that to go along with it, and began to try to teach the heavy metal spirit how to speak. And it was actually a surprisingly fast learner, beginning to pick up on basic communication skills fairly quickly. Afterwards, we were able to learn a fair amount about it. We did give it the option to try to come up with its own name, but it seemed fine with the name Spirit, and the way that it referred to me when trying to communicate with writing seemed to be referring to me in several strange terms. For example, it would often refer to me as home, other times referring to me as father or mother, even master or ruler, creator, and things of that nature, and seemed to have fond feelings of me. To be honest, the heavy metal spirit was quite childlike at first, a sense of wonder about things, but rapidly began to develop, becoming more complex in its line of reasoning and thinking, able to communicate more clearly. We were still working on speaking, and it was starting to get it down, though its speech was still a bit broken. And we had to coach it on proper tone, pitch, and things like that. How loud to make the vibrations when it spoke, as some of its earliest attempts were actually loud enough to break glass. And no, that was not a figure of speech. I had to replace several pieces of dinnerware and one of my glass cabinets. Nylea was especially interested in this entire process, as the heavy metal spirit was the most developed being of its kind that she had seen up to this point. According to Nylea, the entities that I created, or that my predecessors had created, weren't that intelligent even when you tried to teach them. Apparently, their overall intelligence is based on the amount of liquid metal that their body consists of. The more liquid metal in their form, the higher their intelligence can be. Also learning some interesting tidbits about how the heavy metal spirit works. For example, the heavy metal spirit actually has power reserves, an amount of energy that it has to utilize in order to survive, live, and function, meaning it's completely incapable of existing without me, because apparently I'm its energy source, which is why I was a bit relieved to hear that after one of the terms that it used to describe me was food or sustenance. Apparently, the heavy metal spirit feeds off of my telekinetic wavelength, just the same as the rest of the liquid metal does, simply in higher concentrations. And unlike the rest of my liquid metal, the heavy metal spirit wouldn't just wait around patiently for me to cast an order in order to get fed. It would often tell me when it was hungry, at which point I would have to actually pass some of my kinetic wavelength through it in order to revitalize it, at least while it was active and moving around. When it wasn't, it could actually go back inside of me just like the rest of the liquid metal. There, it would slowly absorb telekinetic wavelength from me from the inside, which is what sustains the rest of the liquid metal. The metal apparently doesn't use any energy, so long as it maintains a simple state and doesn't try to take any activity, which is why the rest of the liquid metal is fine regardless of what I do with it, because it doesn't move or act on its own. I turn some liquid metal into a brick, I can basically sit that brick anywhere, and it doesn't lose any energy, because it doesn't change, shift, move. No activity, no energy use. No energy use, it simply maintains the energy it already has. It essentially lasts forever, so long as it's not used. But being that the heavy metal spirit acts of its own accord, it constantly uses and burns telekinetic energy, meaning it has to be fed. We also discovered that the heavy metal spirit isn't immune to the matter loss that the rest of the heavy metal that I produce has to go through when it's subjected to extreme conditions. It can be damaged and lose mass all the same. However, it can also feed on the other heavy metal that I produce in order to reconstruct itself, turning the regular heavy metal into a part of its form. Not only that, while I maintain control over the regular heavy metal, it can actually interact with it on its own accord and will, passing through it or bonding with it as it would if it were simply a part of its body. If I make a cube of heavy metal, the heavy metal spirit could place its finger on it and bond its finger to the material. The order that I gave it to maintain its form would stick. However, the heavy metal spirit could alter it so long as he was making contact with it, but only in the places that he was making contact. Afterwards, it would revert back to the original order that I gave it in terms of shape.